In this day and age, we talk about, I want to find what the objective truth is. But while the objective truth matters and is important, there are other forms of, let's say, truth that also matter.
Our guest, Owen Fitzpatrick, shares how understanding what he calls your inner propaganda can bridge divides in turbulent times. Join us for episode 421 of Growth Igniters Radio with Pam Harper and Scott Harper.
This episode is brought to you by Business Advancement Incorporated, enabling successful leaders and companies to accelerate to their next level of success. On the web at businessadvance.com. And now, here's Pam and Scott.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Pam Harper, founding partner and CEO of Business Advancement Incorporated. And as always, my business partner and husband, Scott Harper, is right here along with me.
Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you again. Our purpose is to ignite new insights, inspiration, and immediately useful ideas that can help visionary leaders accelerate themselves and their companies to their next level of game-changing innovation, transformation, and growth. Now, one of the most important parts of a successful transformation is the degree to which we and others are in sync about moving from what is known into what many people call the great unknown.
And it can be a time of ambivalence and anxiety, along with a time of excitement for many people. And this includes the entire leadership team, CEO, C-suite, and board.
That's right. On the one hand, there are those who are definitely committed to moving forward. They see it as making terrific sense. And then there are those that don't feel that way. They're opposed to moving in the new direction. And this can lead to turbulence and divides that can produce all kinds of conflict, stalls, and a lot more.
Ultimately, success depends upon bridging those divides despite the turbulence and taking on the behaviors that support successful outcomes.
That's right.
And that's why we're glad to be speaking today with Owen Fitzpatrick, CSP, a globe-trotting psychologist and leading authority in how to shape behavior through belief. Now, before we get to this, let's talk a little bit more about Owen's background. He's worked with major organizations such as Google, Pfizer, JP Morgan, and Salesforce. He's coached billionaires and Olympic athletes, and he's the author of 9 books on behavioral science. His 10th book, which will be released on August 4th, 2026, is Inner Propaganda, Leading Hearts and Minds Through Turbulent Times. Pretty appropriate. He's spoken to audiences in 31 countries, and his TEDx Talk and online videos have over 2 million views. And by the way, Owen is from Dublin and currently lives in New York City. I guess he goes back and forth a lot. You can read much more about Owen by going to growthignitersradio.com, episode 421, and scrolling down to the bio link in resources. Owen, welcome to Growth Igniters Radio, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you so much, Pam, and thank you so much, Scott. It's really a pleasure, a delight, and honor to be with you both to chat about it, and really excited for this conversation.
Oh, yes, and there is so much to talk about. So let's start out, though, a little bit about the book. You know, it's an uncommon name, and curious about what inspired you to write your book at this particular time in the world.
Well, Pam, since a very early age, I've been very aware of the importance of mental health. And it's something that I struggled with when I was a teenager. And every now and then, I still struggle with my mental health. And I have had to use every strategy and technique and every system that I've learned over the years that I've used as a therapist initially when I first started out as a psychologist, working with different folks to help them to be able to handle the challenges and crises and problems that they're facing. And it's something that I began to use myself quite a lot. These skills were really about how do you handle the challenges that you face? How do you handle change? How do you handle the issues that seem to crop up? And of course, as leaders, we're very familiar with so many instances of turbulence and change and chaos that are occurring in the modern world today. And so for me, one of the things that I've always wanted to do is to capture a lot of the ideas and insights in such a way that it really resonated with what actually helped me to turn my life around when I was struggling with depression as a teenager, when I was suicidal. What was it that I needed to change? And what it really comes down to is it comes down to belief. The reason why I changed was because my beliefs changed. The reason why I was able to overcome the hurdles I overcame was because my beliefs changed. And when we look at beliefs, we oftentimes think of them as just sort of a positive thinking, but there's a big difference between thinking and believing. And so I was pouring into that, and I began to start to ask myself the question, how do beliefs change? And a huge part of how beliefs change around the world really is through propaganda. So I went to North Korea and I spent some time exposing myself to what propaganda looks like inside that country. I went to Rwanda. I started to do research in terms of the horrible genocide, horrific genocide that happened in 1994. What kind of propaganda was so powerful that could turn people against themselves or against each other? I looked at the propaganda existing today, which is, of course, even more, poisonous as a result of the ability to leverage the media and social media, the polarization that is occurring today. I went to Afghanistan and interviewed people there. So I traveled the world, and the more I did so, the more I came to the realization that the most dangerous propaganda doesn't come from the screen. It comes from the mirror. Because it's not just a case of the fact that we're convinced by the world, we also convince ourselves. And leaders today convince themselves of certain beliefs, and some of those beliefs are empowering and help them to succeed. Some of those beliefs are not. But I think in this day and age, we talk about, I want to find what the objective truth is. But while the objective truth matters and is important, there are other forms of, let's say, truth that also matter. And so what I really wanted to get into was, what is it that we do inside our head that convinces us of the reality that we see? Because if we can understand that as leaders, we can not only lead others through the challenges they face, but we can lead hearts and minds to allow them to be able to take control of their own inner propaganda. And so for me, this isn't just about learning more about you. It's about learning more about you and learning more about those that you lead so that you can really impact them more powerfully and you can transform their life. And it all starts with belief.
Okay. So you mentioned studying political propaganda and social propaganda, and then this internal propaganda, which to me is a lot more powerful image than self-talk. What are the parallels? What have you learned about those parallels that can help us change how we are talking to ourselves, how we are propagandizing ourselves, and how we can have empathy for what other people are going through as well?
Great question. I think, first of all, we have to look at the fact that oftentimes when we talk about what we say to ourselves inside our head, we talk about self-talk. And usually that means, how do you talk to yourself? What's the internal dialogue? As if that's the only element of our thinking that actually affects the way in which we feel. But what I noticed is it's not just what you say to yourself. It's how you say it. It's not just how you say it. It's how you feel at the time. It's not just how you feel at the time. It's what are the presuppositions or assumptions inside of what you say to yourself? What are the beliefs behind what you say to yourself? And a great parallel can be drawn to political propaganda. So if you take, first of all, there's the state media, and the state media is organized to ensure that you feel whatever it wants you to feel. When I was in North Korea, I went along to these huge events that were all celebrating North Korea, right? And the entire communication that was given to me was how amazing this country is. You turn on the news, there's only good news about the country. So on one level, whenever you expose yourself to the media, that affects and influences your state. The same is true of the echo chambers on social media too. But this is how the emotions that we feel influence the beliefs that we hold. And similarly too, as well as the external state media, we also have what I call an internal state media, where we cultivate certain feelings, and those feelings then make us believe certain ideas more than others. The second element is indoctrination. So in any culture where you're a victim, let's say, of propaganda, you are exposed to indoctrination to try to get you to cultivate an identity of who you are. You are one of us. You are a North Korean. You are someone from this area. You are an American. You are someone from Ireland. And so you position yourself, or they position you as having a certain identity that you then have to follow on with. And this can happen inside of families as well. If, there's certain families where, from the time that you're growing up, you're told you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a doctor. And they're indoctrinating you into a certain way of being. And similarly, too, inside our head, we have what I call internal indoctrination, where we take whatever situation we're experiencing and we have to fit that in with who we are. In other words, we construct our identity continuously on an ongoing basis. And then finally, we have what is also known as truth engineering, where they tell us the stories and they give us the reasons as to why the country is the best. So back, during the Cold War, the USSR and the United States would be in a competition battle of propaganda, where the United States would talk about how important it was to be free and this and that and the other. And the USSR would say, no, we're doing better. And they would give reasons and they would cite evidence and they would tell stories and examples to try to convince you. And similarly, too, inside our own head, we make sense of the world through our own truth engineering. We engineer the truth in order to be able to fit with the beliefs that we have. And so what I discovered was most of the propaganda that changes our minds, that cultivates beliefs, starts with what feels right and what fits in with who we are. And only then does it make sense. Only then do the stories and the reasoning and the logic and the explanations actually follow. And we do the same thing inside our mind. Whenever we build a belief, it's usually because initially the belief feels right, it fits in with who we are, and then we generate the explanations. Then we search for or hunt for the rational reasons as to why it's true. And this is a huge, I suppose, challenge to the conventional way that most of us think that we build beliefs. And similarly, too, it's one of the main reasons why leaders struggle to try to convince their team to get buy-in on their new ideas. Because a leader starts by trying to make sense of it. They say, these are the reasons why this is a good idea. But they're not thinking about the person's identity. They're not thinking about what will fit in with who they believe they are. And they're not focusing on how they can make the person feel. And propaganda works largely because of the feeling piece, right? That internal state media. And it also works because of the internal indoctrination. So we need to be mindful of that because that's where we need to start. And once you start there with yourself, it will transform the way you communicate with yourself. So it's not just about what you say to yourself. It's about so much more about how you cultivate the right kinds of feelings. It's about the stories that you engineer, but they have to fit in with your identity and who you believe yourself to be. And therefore, the same needs to happen with the way we communicate with others too.
Wow. I'm just taking all of this in. One of the things that I do know from our own work is how oftentimes the leaders, and I'm talking about CEOs and people in top leadership, will often have conflicting identities in that way. They'll think, I'm a great person. I care about people. And then they'll discover that perhaps people are not seeing that coming across. And they get the message, they get the feedback, 360 feedback and all of that. And the feedback comes back and the leader is crushed because now there's this disconnect. How does that work with inner propaganda? I'm just trying to slow this down because this is something that I see a lot.
So I'm a good person. I believe in people, and yet people tell me, "No, you're brusque. You tell us what to do, whatever."
Sure. I look at three important elements when it comes to identity. The first is what I call perceived identity. That is, who do you believe you actually are? The second is what I call desired identity. That's who do you want to be? And just to hold on both of those for a second, the problem is that most of us, either the perceived identity we have or the desired identity we have, they're the very things that will prevent us from accepting any sort of feedback outside. So when you say, that the leader's crushed, I think sometimes they are because the gap between who they want to be or how they perceive themselves is different to what the outside world is saying. But more often than not, even worse than them being crushed is them dismissing the feedback.
Yeah.
That I've seen too. That I've seen too.
That's it. And I would argue that's an even bigger problem because that means that they're not willing to open their mind to the possibility that what they believe is actually incorrect. And the trouble is that the beliefs that you're most certain of are the ones that you've examined the least often. And so if we want to be able to be better, we need to cultivate what I call the third piece. The term I give it is the anti-fragile identity. And the notion of being anti-fragile is something that was coined by Nassim Nicholas Taleb in his book, Anti-Fragile, Things That Gain from Disorder. So whenever you go through any sort of challenge or adversity, that actually can help you to become stronger and smarter and better and more effective. And so the notion of an anti-fragile leader is recognizing that you're constantly becoming someone better. You're constantly working to improve yourself. And I think the key with leaders is to be able to recognize that you're not always going to ensure that your perception is going to match reality. But even when it doesn't, the key is to learn, well, what is it that I need to do to adjust the way in which I'm performing, and not letting that particular assumption be the immediate stamp on who they are. So in other words, so often we think, if I get negative feedback, if someone says that I'm not a very good boss, I must not be a very good boss. And we immediately make it part of who we are. But our identity is not fixed. And the problem is that so often, and Professor Carol Dweck of Stanford University figured this out years ago, is that some people have a fixed mindset where they believe, this is what I'm good at, this is what I'm bad at, it is what it is. Whereas other people have a growth mindset where they believe that, they can improve, they can get better. And so I think it's critical that when we get that feedback, we cultivate that growth mindset. But I also think that just as important as a growth mindset is what I call a belief growth mindset. And a belief growth mindset is recognizing that you can update your belief. You can be comfortable with being wrong. And if you are, that gives you the opportunity to be able to improve. And so often it's almost like, well, either I'm right and everything's okay, or I'm wrong and it's a disaster. And actually, I would argue sometimes that flips around. Sometimes if you feel that you're right, sometimes that could be the very thing that will impede your success, impede your growth. And especially in a complex, changing, challenging world like we have at the moment, with AI turning, business on its head, we need to recognize our own, with a bit of intellectual or cognitive humility, our own mistakes, our own challenges, the things that aren't perfect, not so that we can immediately beat ourselves up, but so we can go, okay, these are the areas where I'm not where I need to be. And therefore I need to work on those. Because if we don't, we tell ourselves a story that protects us and insulates us from the negative feedback, which makes us feel good in the short term, but destroys our company in the long term, because we're not allowing ourselves to open up. And I think one of the most important skills for leaders is self-awareness. But self-awareness requires allowing ourselves to not just be hijacked by this notion that either I'm a perfect leader like I think I am, or I'm the worst in the world. There's something in between. And the something in between is this anti-fragile notion that every single time you get feedback, it can help you to get better, help you get more effective as a leader, help you to become closer to your team. And when we start to see that, we don't have to worry about our perceived or desired identity. We're always going from our perceived identity. We're checking in with our, I suppose, perceived by other people identity, and we're moving towards our desired identity. And every bit of feedback we get serves to help us to get a step closer to the promised land, if you will.
And on that note, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll talk more with globe-trotting psychologist and author of the new book, Inner Propaganda, Owen Fitzpatrick, about what it takes to reconcile inner propaganda and bridge the divides within ourselves and between others during turbulent times. Stay with us.
This is Growth Igniters Radio with Pam Harper and Scott Harper. That's us. And we're brought to you by Business Advancement Incorporated. That's us again. And we're on the web at businessadvance.com.
Well, we are now well into our 12th year of Growth Igniters Radio. And we're continuing to gain recognition as a top podcast. We've been honored by Thinkers 360 Thought Leaders and the PopCon Podcast Awards. And the Podcast Database Listen Notes has also ranked us in the top 5% of global podcasts. Listeners tell us they enjoy our conversations with visionary CEOs and thought leaders like Owen Fitzpatrick, who are changing the face of business. They're also really enjoying our Pam and Scott Quick Take episodes.
So if you're finding value in our podcast, help us out. Become a recommender. Just open the podcast on whatever app you use and write a review. And please share links to your favorite episodes, maybe this one, on your social media.
And remember, Growth Igniters Radio is only one of the ways we help top leadership teams ignite game-changing innovation and transformational growth. Curious about how we might help you and your company? Well, let's talk. Visit businessadvance.com today and schedule a call. Welcome back to Growth Igniters Radio with Pam Harper, that's me, and Scott Harper. Today, Scott and I are speaking with globe-trotting psychologist and author of the new book, Inner Propaganda, Owen Fitzpatrick. We've been discussing how understanding our inner propaganda can bridge divides that often emerge during turbulent times. Owen, tell us how people can find out more about you and your new book and your speaking.
Thanks so much, Pam. So my website is owenfitzpatrick.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I have a newsletter called Inner Propaganda as well, where you can hear weekly from me about ways to be able to transform your own way of thinking and also influence others more effectively too. I've got a podcast by the same name as well. If you're listening to this and you're interested in the topic, if you go to innerpropaganda.com, there you'll find everything you need to know about the book and about how to get your hands on it.
And I can definitely recommend the newsletter. I've been reading it, and it's just filled with all kinds of important things that go beyond whatever we're talking about here for sure. And I think actually supplement the book very well. So you can find out more information and links for this episode by going to growthignitersradio.com, episode 421, and scrolling down to resources. Now, in the first segment, we talked a bit about how inner propaganda and external propaganda can relate to each other, which is a very interesting way to think about our beliefs and how this works. And that it really starts with us. I mean, in so many ways, we need to be aware of our own inner propaganda before we could bridge any divides that come up, especially in the turbulent times we are talking about having to do with transformational growth. So we left off at this point. Owen, maybe you can bring this whole thing to life with a story from your experience. You don't have to tell us who, but about a CEO who became aware of their inner propaganda and how this enabled them to bridge divides and business growth.
Sure. So a few years ago, I got a call from a CEO at an organization that I worked in. Now, I delivered keynotes, which is one of the main things that I focus on doing. And also I did a follow-up workshop for it. And this was regarding communication, influence skills, how to change minds, how to be able to position themselves using stories in more empowering and more effective way. And he called me up because he was implementing big changes, some technological changes that were occurring in the organization. He called me up and he said, listen, Alan, I'm struggling with something. And he said, there's these changes we need to make. And I've explained to the team why they need to make them, but it's not landing. And there's been a negative response. And there was a number of divisions in the organization. And in most of the divisions, there was a negative reaction, negative response to the changes. And so I asked him to walk me through exactly what he did. And primarily what it was he basically decided on what changes needed to be made. And then he immediately said, okay, so here's what changes we're going to make. I need everyone to get on board. And here's, why this will help the company be even more successful. And when I heard that, instantly, my mind went to the whole feels right, fits in, and makes sense, because that's the framework I work with. Does this feel right? Does it fit in? And does it make sense? Now, he made it make sense. But if you're missing the other two, it's not going to work out.
Right.
And so as we talked, I asked him, how do you think people feel about it? And he goes, well, they're feeling bad about it. I said, no, but how do you think they felt when they heard? And he said, well, they probably felt resistant to it. And I said, well, let's talk a little bit about that. What was going on? Why do you think they felt resistant? And he said, well, they probably felt like this was another change, and we've tried to implement different changes over time. So they probably felt, oh, here we go again. I said, okay, cool. What else? Well, they also are probably a bit nervous because this is a totally different technology that we're bringing in. So I'm not sure that they're comfortable with this as well. I said, great. What else? I said, well, also, I'm pretty much telling them what to do. So I suppose they don't feel a sense of control of what's going on. I said, you hit the nail on the head. And so as I talked through and we did some coaching on it, what he began to start to realize was so much of it was, in order for him to be able to get to implement it, he needs to be able to change the way in which they feel. And that means he needs to, first of all, to call out the elephant in the room and to say, look, in the past, we've tried to implement changes and then we've gone backwards. This is why this needs to be different, or this is why this is going to be different. Number two, he needed to make sure that everyone felt comfortable enough to recognize he understood that this was a little bit more complicated so that they could feel like, okay, we're going to be able to do this. And then number three, he also had to communicate in such a way to make it so that everyone felt like they were a part of the change. They had some level of ownership or autonomy over how the change was implemented.
Right.
Now, that was the first piece. So that's about the feels right. But it also has to fit in with who they are. Because with these changes, some of them would now go from their previous role to a new role. And so one of the things he was trying to get the teams to do using this technology was to make it so that folks that weren't really in sales or were just in the sort of the back office piece, he wanted to get them more on the front lines as well. So they were communicating more about the product and make it so that more and more people would hear about how great this particular product could help them to achieve their results. And that required a big identity shift because you have people that don't see themselves as salespeople or marketing people. And yet now that all of a sudden they were being asked to completely transform who they are. And we can see this in the modern world today. If you look at a lot of folks that were, in coding or expert coders, and now their expertise is being taken over by AI. And now they're more the conductors rather than the coders. That's an identity shift. And so with this particular leader, I walked him through and we talked about how to be able to shift the identity and how to get everyone to start to feel more empowered so he could get them to realize through their perceived identity and their desired identity, this is why this will be natural for you. This is why you're going to be able to do this. And not only this, as we make this change, this is how much better you're going to be as a result of it. So he had to be able to appeal to who they were, not just what this was going to do to the bottom line of the business. And so as we talked through this, he implemented it. And over the course of the next 2 or 3 months, he was able to make a huge change. And they really did turn around in terms of how well they responded to it. And that change continued to grow. And then he actually had some of the people that were most resistant, they became the strongest advocates for it because once again, the identity piece had been dealt with. And again, this was not just the inner propaganda of the leader. This was also the inner propaganda of his team. Right. And in many ways, while we need to recognize our own, in talking through this approach, he first needed to change the way in which he was describing what the story was as to what was going on. Because he didn't start out and say, the reason, Owen, why they're not responding well to change is because it doesn't feel right and it doesn't fit in and it doesn't make sense. He was going in and going, they just won't listen. This is not landing. He was just going, and so that story needed to change. But once we started to look at it from that lens, that's what allowed us to be able to transform things.
Well, what you're talking about applies so well to what we're talking about in this transformation, that story, because increasingly people are going to need to look at themselves as being able to do all kinds of things. We're not our roles. So the propaganda that a lot of people grew up with is, I am a this, I am a that. I used to hear people say all the time, this is my role, I am this.
I'm an accountant.
Right. And that's not the way it is anymore.
Yeah.
It is much more moving into this. I have a set of skills, knowledge, abilities, passions, interests, and they can be applied in all kinds of different ways. That's what I'm hearing in that story. Am I hearing it right?
100%. And I mean, look, your beliefs aren't always factual, but they are always functional, right? They are always trying to accomplish a particular result. And if there's a gap between how you were in the past and how you are today, it means there's probably potentially a gap between who you are today and who you can be in 5 or 10 years from now. And so getting people to recognize that the beliefs that we hold are, in many ways, they're trying to help us in some way. Our brain is like a double agent. On the one hand, it really does amazing things for us. But on the other hand, it's got its own agenda. And our beliefs help us to be able to survive. They don't necessarily help us to be successful. And a lot of people make the mistake of this. We think that our brain is just like logically evaluating everything, but it's not. Our brain is concerned with survival and our brain is concerned with stability. And any beliefs that help us to believe what helps us to survive or helps us to be stable, they'll be the beliefs that we hold a sense of certainty over. And that's the reason why we hold on to them so much. Often I say it's not so much that you change beliefs or you challenge limiting beliefs, it's that you break up with them. Because when you break up with a belief, you're literally breaking up with what feels like a part of yourself. But actually, it's the very thing that's holding you back and preventing you from being who it is that you need to be. And when we talk about limiting beliefs, oftentimes people say, well, I have limiting beliefs and I'm challenging them. Well, the fact that you know that they're limiting means that they're already not as much of a problem as the ones that you don't realize
Yeah.
are your limiting beliefs. Because most of the time we don't say, I have this belief that. We say, this is true. And we make the mistake between the two forms of truth. There's emotional truth, which is what you feel is true, what your gut says. But there's also what I call desired truth. And your desired truth is what you want to believe. And the interesting thing here is that sometimes that could be the worst thing in the world. And sometimes it could be the best. That's why we have to start to help people to parse out the difference between when it works and when it doesn't.
Exactly. Well, we're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, Scott and I will speak more with Owen Fitzpatrick about immediately useful ideas for becoming aware of our inner propaganda. Stay with us.
You're listening to Growth Igniters Radio with Pam Harper and Scott Harper. We're brought to you by Business Advancement Incorporated, where we focus on enabling visionary leaders to dramatically increase the momentum it takes to achieve game-changing results. We're on the web at businessadvance.com.
Have you ever wondered if so many top leaders believe it's important to lead for business transformation and long-term growth in this rapidly changing world, why can it be so challenging to break what I call the orbit of the company's status quo? This is where everyone's busy, but they're not moving forward. They're going round and round in circles, in a sense. As an author and advisor to top leadership teams focused on growing their companies into the future, that was the question that sent me on a long search for answers. So, what's the secret of the great leaders? These successful visionary leaders I call growth igniters. The ones who are able to bring a bold transformational vision to life even as the world keeps changing? That's what I share in my keynote, Break Orbit, Achieving Long-Term Growth in a Short-Term World.
Go to PamHarperSpeaks.com today to find out more about Pam's keynote and her availability to speak at your next leadership conference or executive retreat.
Welcome back to Growth Igniters Radio with Pam Harper and Scott Harper. Over the last two segments, Scott and I have been speaking with globetrotting psychologist and author of the new book, Inner Propaganda, Owen Fitzpatrick. We've been discussing understanding how our inner propaganda can bridge divides that often emerge during turbulent times, and that it starts with ourselves and our own awareness and our own beliefs, and becoming sensitive to others and their inner propaganda. Owen, remind us of how people can find out more about you.
Thanks, Pamela. I'm at owenfitzpatrick.com if you want to learn more about what I do and the kinds of keynotes that I offer. In terms of the book, innerpropaganda.com is where you'll find the book, and this will give you all the information that you need to be able to get your hands on it there. I'm also on social media as well, on LinkedIn and stuff.
Okay. And you can find more information and links for this episode by going to growthignitersradio.com, episode 421, and scrolling down to resources. So we are at the point in our episode where we like to talk about 3 tangible, immediately useful ideas. And in this case, it's about becoming aware of our own inner propaganda. Owen, can you help us out here? What's the first one? We're going to take them one at a time, slow them down here.
No problem. I can indeed, Pamela. So the first one is looking at your feelings. So it's what I call know your feelings. And so one of the things that we need to recognize is the power of our emotions over our reality is quite strong. We experience what we call affective realism, which basically means we don't see the world as it is. We see it as we feel it is. So if you've ever felt hangry, which means you're angry because you're hungry, right, or tangry, which means you're angry because you haven't got enough sleep, that's an example of the fact that our feelings determine and dictate how we feel it. So knowing your feelings is getting more skilled at articulating and describing the specific feelings that you're feeling. So in other words, you want to cultivate what we call emotional granularity. This means describing how you're feeling in a specific term as possible. So not just saying, I feel bad, but I feel pretty frustrated because of X, Y, and Z, or I feel uncomfortable and my stomach feels this way. The more you are specific in the way you describe how you're feeling at that moment in time, the more your brain is getting the information that lets it know exactly what your body needs or what the rest of your brain needs in order for you to be able to start to feel better. So the more specific information we give to our brain about what we're feeling, the more we're able to label it, the better we're able to cope with that. And the more we actually regulate those emotions. And the more you regulate the emotion, the more that actually helps you to stop believing the kinds of things that you might otherwise. So in other words, know your feelings, label your feelings specifically. And by doing so, that will help you to make smarter, better decisions because it's easier for you to parse out, well, I'm doing this because I want to or because I feel strongly about it versus I'm doing this because that's what the evidence suggests. So that's the first technique is label.
To do this, Owen, we have to first be willing to do it. And it's so hard for some of us, at least, to slow down and say, wait a minute, I'm feeling something.
So what do you recommend? What do you recommend
Sure.
as far as how you can get in touch with that feeling sooner? So often it happens in a heartbeat.
I think the key is to recognize that there's certain alerts that we get, right? Whenever you feel bad or frustrated or annoyed or stressed or worried, I mean, how many bad feelings do we feel during the day? Even if we don't want to acknowledge them, we still feel them. And so you don't have to tell anybody about, although it's probably good to tell people about your feelings often, but you don't have to tell anybody. We're not asking people to do anything too scary in terms of, figure out why you weren't loved by your dog when you were growing up, right? That's impossible because all dogs will love you. But it's more a case of recognizing the feeling in the moment. So how do you spot the feeling? The feeling will get you. So it will grab your attention. You find yourself stressed right now. Let's imagine, the listeners are dealing with something and as soon as they finish this podcast, they go out and immediately they remember, a huge stressful event inside their business. Straight away, the first step is to go, okay, I feel really stressed about this event. Just that little sentence actually helps to reduce the intensity. There's all sorts of research out there that shows that when you label something specifically, label an emotion specifically, it diminishes the intensity of that negative emotion. Right. So as soon as you start to feel yourself annoyed or frustrated or feeling down in any way, shape, or form, immediately try to label it, try to be as specific, and you don't have to be right. You just have to get practicing describing what you're feeling when you feel it. And again, how do you know when to do that? Whenever you don't feel amazing.
Okay. So let's talk about the second immediately useful idea. We started with feeling.
Sure. The second one is what I call a belief audit, is really recognizing the belief that you have and starting to ask yourself certain questions about it. So I talked earlier about that, how sometimes we don't even recognize that we have a belief. So it's a good idea sometimes to take some time to write down, how are you thinking about something? So if you're struggling with something, let's imagine you're struggling to cope with something in your business. You're trying to make a certain decision. You know this decision is not something you're feeling comfortable about, or you're supposed to do some new behavior, new action, but you're holding yourself back or you're procrastinating from it. What you do is you just write out a few sentences of what you're feeling, what you're thinking about it. Right? And then you start to look at those sentences and go, what are the beliefs inside of those sentences? Or what are the truths inside of those sentences? And then you take one of the truths, let's say, and you put it there and you start to ask certain questions. And the questions would be, what is it that you believe, which is whatever the truth says? Why do you believe that? What does that do for you? Now, this is different to saying, give me your argument as to why that's true. You're asking, what does that do for you? What does believing that do for you? And this is a very different way of thinking. Because sometimes it's not that it's doing something for you, sometimes it's doing something to you. At the end of the day, we all have our stories. You've got your story, I've got my story. And if our stories don't match, we can find ourselves, butting heads the whole time. Unless we realize that part of what it means to be a leader and part of what it means, quite frankly, to be a human being is to find the commonalities in a story, to try to understand each other's stories so we can start to move forward and build a better, more empowering story which really does heal divides. So the belief audit is you identify the truth or belief that you have, and you ask yourself questions like, why do you believe it? And what is that doing to you, or what is that doing for you? And when you start to investigate it, you realize that those beliefs aren't necessarily nearly as true as you might have thought they once were.
Okay.
Makes a lot of sense, and it helps us move from us and them to we. Yeah. So what's the third idea, Owen?
The third idea is using what I call discernment. And this is the notion of more nuanced thinking. So often we find ourselves using language which is in the extreme. So if all you have to do is turn on the television or turn on social media or your phone or your tablet or computer or whatever, and wherever you go, if you listen to politicians speak, if you listen to most people speak in terms of the media, it's always exaggerated. So everything's extreme, right? There's the us and them, and it's not just, we have a difference of opinion. That doesn't happen anymore. It's like they're the devil themselves, right? We are the goodies. It's always goodies versus baddies. It's always they're, destroying the world, and we are the, most pure of all pures. And if you don't agree with me 100% with everything I say, then you're the devil. And this polarization and this problem is not just causing problems in terms of relationships, personal relationships. It's also destroying businesses too, because so often you're trying to lead a team of people that see themselves as fundamentally different. And so what we need to recognize is that in order for us to be successful, we need to learn more nuanced thinking. We need to be more discerning in the way in which we check things. So every time you have a belief, always try to figure out what is the opposite of that belief. So it's not just about, I'm right with this, so we need to change the organization. Well, what's the opposite of that? We don't need to change anything about the organization. And it's just understanding both beliefs, not so you can get confused, but so you can be a bit more comfortable being more nuanced. Because the more I believe that we're skillful enough at being nuanced with each other, in other words, I'm listening to you, and if you have a different point of view than me, instead of me shutting you down or giving you all the reasons why I'm right and you're wrong, instead I try to understand you so I can find some commonalities between what I believe and what you believe. Then we can have more coherent, more organized conversations. And that can help massively from a business perspective. Because if I'm listening to ideas from my board, what I need to do is ensure that I'm not just dismissing them because it's something counter to what I think. Instead, I try to understand them. I try to be more nuanced and less extreme in the language I'm using. I recognize the language I'm using. And as a result of that, I can start to have more powerful and more influential conversations with other people. So I think this discernment and nuanced thinking, the way in which we get better at is we start to notice the extreme language that's used. And this is universals where people say all this or every that, or it's always like this. It's also the intensity of the language when we use strong labels on it. They're impossible. This is impossible. There's no way you'd be able to do that.
Yes, I have to break in here because I was being told by somebody, that's a difficult person. That's a really difficult person. And I asked them, is it possible that they think you're the difficult person?
Yeah.
And I thought of that right away when you were talking about it. It's just extreme language.
Nuanced thinking, Owen, helps make room for respect. And respect is so important to getting to a common place so that we can close those gaps.
And the key here is, if you ask anyone, right? I love that example, pal. If you ask anyone, do you respect this person? They'll always say yes. Right?
Of course.
People say, yes, I respect. Unless, of course, you're talking politically and then it's like, I don't respect them at all when it's real. But most of the time people say, yes, I respect them. But it doesn't matter whether or not you respect someone. It matters whether or not they feel respected by you.
Absolutely.
That's the key thing. This comes back to the feels right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes,
and on the one hand, I can say I respect you. On the other hand, because of my extreme language, like, why is Pam so impossible? Why is she so difficult? Right. This is, once again, me using this labels language, which is counter to, and someone says, do you respect Pam? Of course I do. But my words don't make Pam feel that way. And therefore, and I'm sure you find this with all of the great work that you do with organizations and with leaders, it is helping them to recognize that the greatest propaganda doesn't come from the screen, it comes from the mirror.
True.
And this is the key, is that we need to recognize that we are convincing ourselves all the time. And so this nuanced language, on the one hand, it really helps our conversations because it means that we're, to your point, Scott, we're demonstrating respect in such a way that they feel respected. But also, and here's the beauty, the more nuanced language you can use with yourself, the more effective decisions you'll make and the better your mental health will be. Because think about it like this, instead of saying, everything's a disaster, my whole life is ruined. Instead, you can start to be more nuanced there and go, this specific area of my life is not going how I wanted to yet, but this is still good. This is still good. This is still good. So in other words, the more we can actually get more accurate and more nuanced with our language inside our head too, the more that transforms our relationship with ourselves. And of course, to the point we already made, it also improves the relationships we have with others as well.
Absolutely.
More options.
Owen, my gosh, we're at the end of our episode. Any final thoughts you can leave us with about how understanding your inner propaganda could bridge divides?
Sure. So I have a concept I like to call becoming the belief leader. And that means regarding yourself as someone who isn't just responsible for disseminating information or for communicating with others, but you are actively someone who can cultivate and create beliefs in the minds of other people. And when you take responsibility as being a belief leader, it means you're no longer just communicating what you think. You're thinking more strategically, not just about where your business is going, but how you're going to influence and impact the folks that you work with. And I think if everyone's to take responsibility for being the belief leader that they can be, this is the first step. It's about how you make people feel. It's about recognizing the identity that they have. And then, and only then, can you communicate the stories and the logical reasoning as to why what you're suggesting makes sense. But when we start to think in this way, for me, this is how we transform organizations, and this is how we win.
Well, Owen, thank you very much for sharing your viewpoints. And again, congratulations on your book. I'm looking forward to reading it myself.
Thank you so much. Thanks a million.
Thanks so much, Owen. And to all of you out there who are listening to Growth Igniters Radio, thank you. To contact us, get show notes and resource links for this week's episode, go to growthignitersradio.com, select episode 421.
Until next time, this is Pam Harper, wishing you continued success and leaving you with these questions to reflect upon and act upon. Starting today, how can I become more aware of my own inner propaganda?
Growth Igniters and Growth Igniters Radio with Pam Harper and Scott Harper are registered service marks of Business Advancement Incorporated. All Growth Igniters Radio episodes are copyrighted productions of Business Advancement Incorporated, intended for the private use of our audience. Except as otherwise provided by copyright law, all other uses including copying, editing, redistribution, and publication without prior written consent of Business Advancement Incorporated are prohibited. All rights reserved.